Joining me now to try to unpack this a bit is Tom Winter, NBC News investigative reporter, Rob Costa, Washington Post national political reporter and MSNBC political analyst, Chuck Rosenberg, former U.S. attorney, former senior FBI official and an MSNBC contributor, and Evelyn Farkas, the Pentagon's former top Russian expert and an MSNBC national security analyst. So, Tom, let me start with you on the reporting aspect of this. All of this, we've learned over the last 3 weeks the importance of this meeting thanks to sidebar transcripts of Andrew Weissmann in this Manafort trial. Manafort continues to claim that whatever he did misled Mueller about was an accident. That he basically didn't realize he lied. Why do we think the judge has even a remote possibility of believing Manafort?
Well, for a couple of reasons that she's kind of already signaled and that the Manafort team discussed today, Chuck, which is essentially this. A lot of the discussions between Manafort and federal investigators working for Robert Mueller's team occurred just between the investigators and attorneys or just between the investigators and Paul Manafort, and those were not grand jury discussions that took place. There's a difference. When you testify before the grand jury, there's a transcript of that. Now, normally we never see it because it's a grand jury, but a judge can see it. But if you're meeting just with investigators, they generate what's called an FBI 302. It's just the form is a 302 form. That's the heading at the top of it. And it's a report on that particular meeting, interview, session, et cetera. We've seen some of these become more and more public over the past years as investigations that are very much in the public eye. Think of the Hillary Clinton email investigation. Right. We were able to see the 302 of her meeting with them. It's not a direct transcript. And the judge has already signaled that she has a little bit of a tough time telling from the FBI 302 what the necessary intent was or what the specific dialogue was. So there is a little bit of a window here for some of the things that Mueller's team has said Paul Manafort has lied about, for those things to actually turn out to be things that the judge may not quite see is materialize, although she may acknowledge was he being as forthcoming as he should have been or needed to be. Right. That's a separate question.
Chuck Rosenberg, I want you to help add to this here. Let me put up the full screen. This is the February 4th court transcript. This is sort of what got reporters realizing that how important this meeting was. I'm going to read from, this is Weissmann speaking, and half of it's redacted, but let me put it up. You can see the redaction. That meeting, referring to this Grand Havana Club meeting, that meeting and what happened at that meeting is of significance to the special counsel. In looking at the issue of what, redacted, 4 straight lines, comma, all are the focus of and are raised by the issue of the August 2nd meeting. Now, according to Washington Post reporting, a supposed peace plan with Ukraine, sanctions, and Trump polling was all either discussed or exchanged at this meeting. It's possible that's what's in that redaction. What do you take away from all of this?
Well, from the reporting, Chuck, I mean, there's a bunch of questions that any prosecutor would have. What was passed and sort of how detailed was it? Why was it passed? How did they get the stuff that they passed? Who knew about it? So if those exchanges actually took place and if the polling data was really as detailed, perhaps, as we might imagine it to be, sure, that's a big deal. Moreover, you have 3 people at that meeting. One convicted, Manafort. Right. One convicted and fully cooperating, Gates. Right. And that is an important name to remember.
I assume it feels like he's the person that has surfaced the importance of this meeting.
Well, we're not getting it from Kilimnik. Right. And we're not getting everything.
We don't know Manafort, right?
From Manafort, perhaps. But we know Gates is fully on board. And so he's a very important window into that meeting for prosecutors.
You know, the other part of this was how President Trump, as a candidate in that same period, August 2nd is the meeting. And I want to emphasize this because here is Donald Trump on July 31st, obviously 2 days earlier on a Sunday show, being asked about Ukraine. Take a listen.
That whole part of the world is a mess under Obama, with all the strength that you're talking about and all of the power of NATO and all of this. In the meantime, he's going away. He takes Crimea. He's sort of, I mean...
But you said you might recognize that.
I'm going to take a look at it. But, you know, the people of Crimea, from what I've heard, would rather be with Russia than where they were. And you have to look at that also.
Robert Costa, you were covering this Trump campaign as close as anybody. Who would it be telling Donald Trump at the middle of July that giving him that Kremlin talking point that most of those people speak Russian, Was that Mike Flynn? Was that Paul Manafort? I know you were as close as any reporter trying to figure that world out.
Looking back at that time, Michael Flynn, General Flynn, was developing a relationship with then-candidate Trump, really cultivating the candidate. He was one of the only people from the foreign policy establishment who was going up to the 26th floor at Trump Tower, briefing the president. And you knew Flynn was against the Obama administration because of his hard break with the president then. And you also know that Paul Manafort was in the candidate's ear, getting ready for the convention in July, talking through foreign policy with the candidate. He was running the ship. The president was still skeptical of Manafort as a candidate in some respects. But on foreign policy, Trump was so undeveloped as a candidate that people like Flynn and Manafort could go into that void.
Evelyn Farkas, explain at that moment, hearing that candidate say that. Nobody else was saying that.
Yeah.
Not a Republican.
Yeah.
And obviously, at this point, he's the only Republican left. But nobody in the foreign policy community was saying this at this point. Correct me?
Yes, and I think, if I remember correctly, I was in Miami, and I think I was, woken from my vacation reverie because what he said was outrageous. I mean, the idea that he's basically spouting the Russian line, the Russian propaganda about Crimea, saying, well, these people were Russian speakers and they wanted to be part of Russia. That's irrelevant.
By the
what
way,
they did was invade.
They're Spanish speakers in states in this country. Does that mean they belong to Mexico?
Well, and even if they want to be part of Mexico, that's not how it works.
Right.
Mexico can't march across the border and take them back.
Right.
So that's counter to international law. So, he was basically taking the line. It sounds to me like it probably came more from Manafort than Flynn.
Okay.
Because first of all, Flynn wasn't in government when this happened.
Was there any mainstream American foreign policy person pushing this other than these two men?
No. I mean, no. They may have said, yes, of course, there's a kernel of truth to what the Russians say, which is to say that these are ethnically Russian, they're Russian speakers, ethnically Russian to the extent that there were a lot of Russians who were based there, so they had a big military presence, and of course the families were accompanying them. But the reality was that this decision was made over the head of the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian people. It was an invasion. It was a military seizure, the first time that this had happened since World War II. And it opened the door, unfortunately, potentially to more seizures like this. Thankfully, President Obama and all the other Western leaders and the United Nations as a whole said this will not stand.
And just to re-up, at August 1st, 2016, the number one foreign policy problem for Russia was what? These sanctions, right?
Yes, of course.
Okay.
Of course. I mean, they wanted to control Ukraine. They would say their number one problem was, controlling Ukraine, which then led to sanctions.
All right. This brings me then to what is collusion? What is direct? What is circumstantial? And I want to point all this out. So I'm back to you, Tom Winter. We have Ken Dilanian's reporting from the Senate Intel Committee, and we're hearing Richard Burr. And in fairness, Richard Burr doesn't use the word direct evidence. He uses factual evidence of collusion. Sure. It was our wording said direct evidence. Explain what that means, Tom.
Well, direct evidence would be, let's think of another crime and maybe a simpler crime to understand. Let's think of a homicide. So direct evidence would be, we have Tom Winter on videotape. We have a gun that we recovered at the scene with Tom Winter's fingerprints on it. The gun is registered to Tom Winter, and we have eyewitnesses saying Tom Winter was there and we saw him fire the gun that killed that other person. Those are really direct evidence type items. And really the actual physical evidence, I would say, Chuck might argue, would be the real direct evidence there. But when you have indirect evidence or circumstantial evidence, those are things of saying, well, so-and-so was at this place meeting with this person, and then after that, that person directly went and committed that homicide, or Tom Winter directly did something after that meeting. So what was discussed at that meeting? And is the other person at that meeting somewhat culpable or part of a broader conspiracy? So it's kind of putting together incidents and events that occurred, communications that occurred, fact patterns that have occurred. That can be part of circumstantial evidence. I just want to point out, because I think there's been a lot of back and forth here, Chuck, about this issue with respect to Trump collusion and or coordination. And it has not been said to me by anybody that I think has a good handle on this investigation that is there some sort of agreement involving the president and the Russian side to do something regarding this election. I have not heard that. What what I think could come up is, are there people in the Trump campaign orbit, as we just spent the last 12 minutes talking about, that had closer ties to Russia, and how did that come into play? And then there's the question of, was the president or other people in the campaign aware? I think those are going to be kind of the fissure points, if you will, or the fracturing lines of where we'll see this investigation go.
Well, Tom, look, you're setting up Chuck Rosenberg here, and Chuck, I have this graphic here that I can't make a graphic. I can't put on television. You can see it here. It's so many lists of the circumstantial evidence, the indirect evidence. And I guess my question is let's take this August 2nd meeting. You have Kilimnik, you have Manafort, you have Gates, you have an exchange of information. But the direct evidence is circumstantial. So what are we staring at here? Is this what a conspiracy case looks like?
Yeah, it sure does. So I've tried lots of conspiracy cases in federal court. At the end of every trial, conspiracy or anything for that matter, the federal judge tells the jury that circumstantial evidence and direct evidence are entitled to equal weight. They're essentially just different ways of proving a fact that's in contest. Think of it this way. I walk into your studio, which has no windows, by the way.
No, it's
soaking wet. And I'm carrying an umbrella. And so that's circumstantial evidence that it's raining.
Right.
You don't know that it's raining, but you have some inferences you can draw from the fact that I'm dripping on your carpet, right? So a jury is allowed to infer facts, right, and conclude from those facts based on circumstantial evidence. No different. By the way, in a conspiracy, all these things on your list here, in a conspiracy, you're not going to see direct evidence, because direct evidence of the conspiracy would be what? A written conspiratorial agreement.
And then it's no longer a conspiracy.
Well, no, it still may be, but who's dumb enough to actually put a conspiracy down in writing? And so you would normally prove a conspiracy through circumstantial evidence.
This entire investigation is an investigation of circumstantial evidence. Fair?
Almost all investigations consist of circumstantial evidence. Maybe not exclusively, but they certainly include it.
All right. Robert Costa, is President Trump aware that it's not as exculpatory as it sounded?
Well, at this point, the president is waiting for the Mueller report. He's waiting to see how this all plays out. The White House is trying to seize on the Senate Republican investigation and Richard Burr, the chairman's conclusions that he doesn't really find a lot of evidence. But Democrats, of course, are contesting that conclusion. And it's a real fight, but no one really inside of this White House knows where this is going to lead.
Hello, YouTubers. If you're watching this, it means you've checked out our channel, so thank you. Now do me a favor, subscribe by clicking on that button down there. Click on any of the videos to watch the latest interviews and highlights from MTP Daily and MSNBC. You can get more Meet the Press content every morning in the First Read newsletter. If you're tired of content that you don't know anything about where it came from, you don't have to have that problem with us. NBC News, MSNBC, MTP, and the Meet the Press mindset right here for you on YouTube. Subscribe now.